Greetings, dear friends. Glad you tuned in today to our broadcast. I'm Warren Litzman, sitting in my office in Dallas, Texas, bringing to the entire world by computer the message, Christ is the life of the born-again believer. Those are big words, aren't they? Those are big statements. But you see, I believe them. I don't just throw them out when I get to talking here on this broadcast. I talk to you out of my heart what the scriptures say, trying to touch some of you, trying to help some of you through the awful maze there is in the world today, trying to be God's child, a Christian. We've been studying in Romans, the 6th chapter, and we're ready to start the 19th verse. It begins by saying, Paul says, I speak after the manner of men because of the infirmity of your flesh. For as you have yielded your members servants to uncleanness, to iniquity unto iniquity, even so now yield your members servants to righteousness unto holiness. That's a big scripture, isn't it? Has a lot of good things to say in it, so let's go back and look at the first line. He said, I speak after the manner of men because of the infirmity of your flesh. That's kind of neat, isn't it? He called our fleshly works a disease. Kind of a disease. We got a lot of people in religion who do works. They pick up any kind of work they can and say, God, we did it in your name. We did it for your glory. Bless us now. Well, I'm going to tell you, works won't get done anymore. If you'd lived in the Old Testament and you wanted to do some great works for God, it would have been a different matter altogether. But he says something here that's kind of important. He says, because of the infirmity of the flesh. What do you mean by that? Why is he putting that before people who know Christ lives in them? Because these are the people that Paul has come to minister to, and he doesn't minister anything but Christ in the human being. He says, I speak after looking toward, looking at people who have an infirmity of the flesh. Infirmity of the flesh. They have a disease. They could have Christ in them as their basic salvation. They could be living the life of that Christ because he was placed in them that he might stand perfect before God as us. But you know what? A lot of people can't let go of their works. They think their works is what's going to do it. They've never gotten to Paul's epistles yet. They may be following Peter. Peter believed in works. He believed a lot of good things, but he preached the circumcision gospel. That's a work man does, not God. There were other followers of Christ. James and some others in Paul's day who preached works. You know what? The greatest man God ever raised up supernaturally to carry out his mission was the Apostle Paul. There, you got it from me. I'll say it like it is. There's not another man in the Bible or one who ever lived on this earth who had a more important mission for God than the Apostle Paul did. He was given information that God had withheld for over 4,000 years. Knew that it had to take place, that it would take place, that he would make it take place. But he waited until he got the right man to preach it and teach it. And that was the Apostle Paul. Somebody scolded me not long ago because of something I said about Paul's writings, and in at least 10 places in his epistles, he says, follow me as I follow Christ, or follow me in following Christ, or do it like I do it, or see how I do it, and that's the way you should do it. Why would he make all these kind of statements? 10 of them I counted. Why would he make those kind of statements? It's simple. God put on him the heaviest burden that any human being ever had in the history of the universe. He was given the responsibility to go and tell people that God's not saving men anymore. He is placing the saving life of Christ in men. And that's their salvation. Saved not by them doing something, but saved by Christ's life in them. That isn't hard to believe. That isn't hard to believe. Saved by his life. Dear friends, works of men is an infirmity. Man doing something to please God is a sickness, as Paul puts it here. Infirmity. I speak after the manner of men because of the infirmity of your flesh. When you do something on your own to please God, you've got a sickness. You've got a disease. It's an infirmity. It'll hold you back. It'll stop you from moving on into the things of God. It'll hinder you in anything you do as unto the Lord. You have a problem with the Scriptures when you have this disease of the flesh. These are fleshly works he's talking about here. He's talking about men who do things because they think they can do them within themselves. He goes on in the next line and says, for as you have yielded your members servants to uncleanness. Uncleanness. What is uncleanness? That's part of this disease. This disease where they had to do something. I guess I've mentioned it several times before, but we had a big church here in Dallas, Texas, and they were just putting finishing touches on the building of their cathedral. And they put a sign out on the front of the church and said, take a look at all of this. This is what people's tithes have done. Well, you listen to me, you know, I don't include the word tithe anywhere in the New Testament to be a form of dedication from a believer. Tithe is in the Old Testament, and if you're going to tithe, you need to tithe 10% of everything. You're not called to do that anywhere in grace. Grace says you give because you love God. Grace says because you love God, He'll bless you. It is never taken away from love. There's no such teaching in grace that if you don't give the money you're supposed to God, you'll go to hell. You can find scripture for that other places in the Bible, but you won't find it in grace. And that's where you have to rightly divide the word, the scriptures. You have to be honest, truthful, to rightly divide soul and spirit. Because there's a new walk with God. There's a new way to live. There's a new kind of salvation, all based on the cross. I hear people say often, well, Old Testament saints got saved looking forward to the cross. Let me tell you something. Nobody in the Old Testament ever had Christ in them as their hope of glory. Nobody. In fact, I know of no occasion where anybody in the Old Testament ever mentioned such a thing. That's far out. That's above and beyond anything a human being could ever think, that God would take His Son, the Spirit of His Son, Jesus Christ, and place Christ in the believer. He puts out the old way of doing things, the old man, and the new man is Christ. That's the way God wanted it. That's the way He's going to fill up His house, with people who have really been born again. And so our scripture says here, Paul speaking, if I could paraphrase it, he says, I'm talking to these men because of the infirmity of the flesh, where men think they can within themselves do something. For you can yield your members servants to uncleanness and to iniquity, unto iniquity. Strange wording there, but I'm sure the point is made. You have yielded your members servants to uncleanness, to a disease, he says, infirmity. What's wrong with that? Why is Paul talking like that? I'll give you a little hint. Everybody that's saved, genuinely saved, born again, have Christ placed in them. They are baptized into Christ, and Christ saturates them. It's a Christ thing. Now, if you know that, if you know that Christ lives in you, Paul would say is your hope of glory, but let's pause before we get to that. If you know that Christ lives in you, what great, awful thing have you done? You have taken the members of your body that Christ came to use for His glory. You've taken them away from Him. You've gone and done your own thing. He cannot see without your eyes. He cannot hear without your ears. He cannot speak without your voice. He doesn't have hands. The Spirit of Christ in the human being doesn't have hands except yours. Doesn't have feet to go anywhere except yours. So the awful thing he speaks of in this 19th verse is the sickness that comes upon the people, and they take the members of their body that Christ came to use. They take their members away from Him. Maybe they don't know He wants them. Maybe they don't even know if He lives there. But when you take your members of your body away, your thinking, your will, your emotion, if you take it away from Christ, He has nothing to use in you. He's going to use you like God created you. But He come to live in you, to be the same Jesus by Spirit, working through the same body. That's Christianity. That's what Christianity's all about. I've often thought, God, who knows all things, must have known that the world after the cross would get full of preachers and seminarians and just sick minds who would change it, change the purpose. Because God putting Christ in it, he that is joined to the Lord is one spirit. He putting Christ in us and us becoming totally dependent upon the Christ spirit that's in us would get the gospel to the world. Surely that crossed God's mind. But now we have a multitude of people on their way to the Father's house who've never had a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. What a thought. What a thought. I'll get back to some of this next broadcast. Got to go now. God love you and bless you. Bye-bye.